The morning Sophia Reyes walked into the glass tower on Fifth Avenue, she was wearing her best cream blouse, dark jeans, and the flat shoes she always wore when she needed to feel grounded. She had chosen them deliberately, the same way she had chosen everything about this moment, with careful and deliberate intention. The baby carrier strapped across her chest held little Rosie, 3 months old and fast asleep, her tiny fists curled against her mother's heartbeat. In Sophia's left hand was a leather folder containing the divorce papers she had already signed. Every line, every clause, every cold legal sentence had been read. 3 times before her pen ever touched the page, she had not told anyone she was coming. She had not sent a message or made a phone call. She had simply woken up that morning, fed Rosie, dressed them both, and decided that today was the day. She would close the chapter of her life, called Elliot Harmon. The lobby of Harmon Industries smelled like money. Cool air, polished marble, and fresh flowers arranged in tall white vases near the reception desk. The woman behind the desk recognized Sophia immediately, and her eyes went wide before she could hide the reaction. Sophia gave her no time to gather herself. She simply said his name, said she knew where his office was, and walked toward the elevator before anyone thought to stop her. The elevator carried her up 40 floors without making a sound. She watched her own reflection in the polished steel doors and barely recognized the woman looking back. She looked stronger than she felt. She looked like someone who had survived something enormous because she had. She had survived the worst night of her life, then survived the 9 months that followed, then survived labor on a hospital bed with no one holding her hand, then survived every morning since then when she woke up and chose to keep going. The elevator opened, and Sophia walked down the corridor toward the corner office. She had visited dozens of times during their marriage. The assistant near the door stood up instantly and said something about a meeting in progress. But Sophia was already pushing through. The double doors, the room went quiet the way rooms go. Quiet when something unexpected arrives? Elliot. Harmon was standing behind his massive oak desk in a charcoal suit that fit him like it had been sewn directly onto his body. He was tall and broad-shouldered with dark, brown hair, and the kind of jaw that made people trust him before he ever opened his mouth. He looked exactly the way she remembered him, handsome and confident and completely unaware of the damage he had left behind. Beside him, perched on the edge of the desk with one elegant leg crossed over the other, was a woman Sophia had seen in magazine photographs. Cassandra Wells wore a red wrap dress and a diamond on her left hand that caught the light. From the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her, she was laughing at something Elliot had said just before the doors opened. And that laugh froze on her lips the moment she saw Sophia standing in the doorway with a baby against her chest. Elliot's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise first, then something that looked like fear, then a blankness that Sophia recognized as the mask he wore. When he did not want anyone to see what was happening inside him, Sophia walked in like she owned the room. She placed the leather folder on his desk without saying a word and then looked at him with the steadiest eyes she had ever managed in her life. She said she had come to sign the papers and that she assumed he still had his copies ready. She said she did not want his money, did not want the apartment, did not want anything that connected her name to his, except the one thing he could not give back and could never undo. She adjusted the carrier, gently, and Rosie stirred, making the small, breathless sound that babies make when they are about to wake. Elliot's gaze dropped to the carrier, and something happened to his face that Sophia had never seen before. The mask fell completely. Every carefully constructed layer of CEO composure simply dissolved, and what was underneath was raw and stricken and completely without defense. He said her name. Just her name? Barely above a whisper. Sophia looked at him without mercy and without cruelty and told him that Rosie was his daughter. She said it the way you state a fact about the weather. She said it because it was true, and because he deserved to hear it in plain language. With no softening and no preparation, the silence that followed was the loudest silence Sophia had ever stood inside. Cassandra slipped off the desk. Her hand went to her mouth. Her eyes moved between Sophia and the baby, and then to Elliot and back again. reading the room with the kind of intelligence that told Sophia this woman was sharper than the magazines made her look. Elliot moved around the desk toward Sophia, and she took one step back. Not from fear, but from clarity. She knew if he got too close, she might feel something she was not ready to feel, and she could not afford that. Not today. Not here. He asked how. He asked when. His voice cracked on the second question. Sophia told him. She told him calmly and without emotion, because she had rehearsed this moment in her head so many times that she had already grieved the version where he broke down and it moved her. She told him that 11 months ago she had come home to their apartment with the most important news of her life. She had held a positive pregnancy test in her hands, and her heart had been so full it frightened her. She had walked through their front door and found him on the couch with a bottle of whiskey half gone and an expression on his face, like the world owed him something it had refused to pay. She had tried to tell him. She had said his name, and he had not even looked up. She had said she had something important to share, and he had laughed in a way that was not a laugh at all, but a sound that told her he was already somewhere else inside himself, somewhere dark and far from her. And then he had told her to go. He had used ugly words. He had told her she exhausted him. He had told her that she added nothing to his life. He had told her he never wanted to see her face again, so she had left. She had sat in her car in the parking garage for 2 hours, not moving. She had been terrified her body would betray her from the shock, and she had been so careful with herself during those weeks because she already knew about the baby, even though she had not yet said so out loud. She had driven herself to an urgent care clinic at midnight, alone, and a kind nurse had reassured her that the baby was fine. And then Sophia had made a decision. If Elliot Harmon did not want her, she would become someone who did not need him. She had moved out the next morning while he slept. She had found a small apartment in a neighborhood she could afford on her salary as a restaurant manager. She had worked right up until her 8th month. She had taken a childbirth class by herself and sat in a room full of couples and not once allowed herself to feel sorry about the empty chair beside her. She had given birth on a Tuesday morning, and the first person she called was her best friend Priya, who had flown in from across the country and held her hand through every contraction. She had named the baby Rosie because Rosie sounded like something that could survive anything. A flower that grew back no matter what the season took from it. Now she stood in Elliot's office with their daughter sleeping against her chest, and she slid the divorce papers across the desk and uncapped her pen and told him it was time to sin. Elliot stared at the papers, and then at Rosie, and then at Sophia, and his face held an expression she had no name for. It was not guilt alone and not grief alone. It was the look of a man who had finally understood the size of what he had thrown away. Cassandra spoke quietly from the corner of the room. She asked Elliot in a voice stripped of its earlier lightness whether he had told Sophia to leave. Whether those had been his actual words, Elliot did not answer Cassandra. He was still looking at Sophia. Sophia capped her pen. She told him she was not interested in his silence or his regret. She told him she had come for one purpose, and one purpose only. She told him that Rosie deserved to know the truth of who her father was someday, and Sophia had chosen honesty over erasure. But she was not going to wait in this room for him to find words that would not change anything. She picked up the folder and walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard him say her name again. She heard him say, "Please." She heard his voice break on that single syllable, the way ice breaks when the temperature finally shifts and cracks. Run through what seemed solid, she did not turn around. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. The doors opened. She stepped inside and held Rosie a little tighter against her chest. She looked at her daughter's sleeping face. The round cheeks and the small pink mouth and the dark lashes against soft brown skin, and she whispered something that was just for the two of them. The elevator descended. Somewhere above her, in a glass office full of everything money could build, Elliot Harmon stood with unsigned papers on his desk and a fiancée who was already reaching for her ring. Finally understanding that she had been something beautiful, placed in the wrong story all along. The days after Sophia walked out of Harmon Industries were quiet in the way that follows a storm. Not peaceful, but emptied. Sophia returned to her small apartment, laid Rosie in her crib, sat down on the kitchen floor, and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to feel everything before she got up and made herself a cup of tea and got on with the business of living. Priya called that evening. Sophia told her everything in the flat, the factual way she had learned to speak about Elliot, stripping the story of drama because drama gave him too much space inside her life. Priya listened without interrupting, which was the greatest gift she could give. And when Sophia finished, Priya simply said that she was proud of her and that Rosie was the luckiest baby alive to have her as a mother. Sophia held on to those words for days. Elliot tried to reach her on the third morning after the office confrontation. She saw his number appear on her phone screen, and she watched it ring until it stopped. He tried again that afternoon. She watched it ring again. On the fourth day, she sent him a single message that said she would be in touch through her lawyer, that any further direct contact would be considered harassment. She did not feel powerful sending it. She felt tired in a way that sleep could not fix, the kind of tired that lived in the bones and came from carrying too much alone for too long. She did not expect was Cassandra. The knock came on. Saturday morning when Sophia was sitting on the living room floor with Rosie on a soft blanket between her knees, trying to coax a smile out of her daughter by making ridiculous faces. She looked through the peephole and stood very still for a moment before she opened the door. Cassandra. Wells looked different outside of her natural habitat. She was still beautiful and still put together, wearing simple cream trousers and a pale blue sweater, but she looked smaller somehow. The diamond was gone from her finger. Her eyes were clear, but carried the particular tiredness of someone who had not been sleeping well. Sophia kept the door half open and asked what she wanted. Cassandra said she was not there to defend Elliot or to ask for anything. She said she simply needed to understand what she had been part of without knowing it, and that she believed Sophia deserved to be asked directly rather than spoken about in rooms she was never invited into. Sophia studied her for a long moment. Then she opened the door the rest of the way. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table while Rosie lay on her blanket in the living room, making soft sounds to herself. Sophia made no offer of tea or pleasantries. She waited. Cassandra spoke carefully. She said she had been with Elliot for 14 months. She said that in all that time she had known something was missing in him, some fundamental presence that he kept behind a wall she could not find the door to. She said he mentioned Sophia occasionally, small references that slipped out before he caught them, a restaurant she had loved, a song that came on the radio, the particular way she organized things. He always stopped himself and apologized. But Cassandra had learned to recognize what an apology was covering. She said she wanted to know who Sophia was. Not the wife, not the woman in the carrier, but the actual person, because she had spent over a year loving the ghost of someone she had never met, and she needed to put a face to the shape that had been standing between her and Elliot the entire time. Sophia looked at the woman across from her and felt something unexpected. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition. Two women sitting in the wreckage of the same man's inability to be whole. She told Cassandra who she was. She told her about the restaurant where she had worked her way up from waitress to manager by the time she was 26. She told her about meeting Elliot when his company held a dinner event there, how he had stayed after everyone left to apologize for a rude comment one of his board members had made to the staff, which was the kind of thing she had not expected from a man in his position. She told her about the 2 years of dating where everything felt like it was building toward something real. In the wedding that was small because Sophia had no family money and Elliot had insisted he did not need a spectacle. She told her about the first year of marriage that was genuinely good, then the second year when the cracks began, then the third year when Elliot started drinking on the evenings he would not explain and coming home with eyes that looked at her like she was part of whatever had gone wrong in his day. Cassandra listened to all of it without looking away. Sophia said she did not hate Elliot. She said hatred required ongoing energy she preferred to spend on Rosie. She said she understood that damaged people, and that the cycle was old and almost predictable. But understanding something did not require you to stand inside it and keep absorbing the impact. Cassandra nodded slowly. She said she was sorry. She said she meant that in the cleanest possible way. Not as performance, but as one woman, acknowledging another woman's pain. Sophia accepted it in the same spirit. When Cassandra left, she paused in the doorway and looked at Rosie on her blanket. She said the baby was extraordinary. She said she could see both of them in her, the softness of Sophia and the jaw of Elliot, and that it was almost unfair how beautiful she was. Sophia looked at her daughter and agreed. After Cassandra's car disappeared from the street below, Sophia leaned against the closed door and breathed. Priya had texted to check in, and Sophia typed back that she was fine, that a ghost had just come to say goodbye, and that she thought the haunting was finally over. What she did not expect after that was Elliot showing up changed, not transformed in a dramatic or cinematic way, not arriving with speeches or grand gestures designed to overwhelm her defenses. He showed up changed in the small, stubborn, ordinary way that real change actually looks, which is to say he showed up at all, consistently, without drama, exactly when he said he would. Sophia's lawyer had contacted his lawyer, and they had arranged a framework for contact with Rosie. Supervised visits. 2 hours on Sunday afternoons, with Priya present because Priya had flown back from across the country and moved into Sophia's spare room without being asked, which was the kind of friendship that could not be purchased or manufactured. Sophia had set the rules with the cold precision of someone who had learned that. Softness without boundaries was just another word for exposure. No photographs. No social media. No sharing of her address with anyone. No arriving early. No arriving late. The first Sunday, Elliot knocked on the door at exactly the agreed time, not a minute before or after. His hands were empty. No flowers, no gifts, no offerings that could be read as attempts to buy his way into the room. He was wearing jeans and a plain gray shirt, and he looked like he had been awake for a long time. Priya opened the door and looked at him. The way a person looks at something they are not yet convinced is safe. She told him the rules again, slowly, and he listened without interrupting. Sophia was sitting on the couch with Rosie in her lap when he came in. She watched him see his daughter and watched his whole body change. His shoulders dropped. His jaw loosened. He crossed the room and crouched down to Rosie's level, like he was approaching something sacred and fragile. And when Rosie turned her wide dark eyes toward him with that particular expression babies have, when they are deciding whether someone is worth their attention, Elliot looked like a man receiving a verdict he had not earned. Sophia told him how to hold her. Her voice was clinical and direct, the way she spoke to new staff at the restaurant when teaching them something important. One hand behind the head, one under the back. He followed her instructions with a concentration that almost looked painful. When Rosie settled against his chest without protest, Elliot let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. He did not try to speak to Sophia beyond the practical. He did not attempt explanations or apologies during that first visit. He simply sat with his daughter in the chair across the room while Priya watched from the corner and Sophia watched from the couch. And he held Rosie like she was the most important thing he had ever been trusted with, because she was. The visits continued. Each Sunday, each time, exactly on schedule. Each time Sophia watched him become incrementally more natural with Rosie, the stiffness giving way to something genuine. And each time she felt her own carefully maintained distance shift in ways that frightened her. On the fourth Sunday, Rosie smiled at him. Not a reflex, not gas, but a real sunrise smile directed at the man sitting across from her. And Elliot made a sound Sophia had never heard from him before. Something between a laugh and a sob that he swallowed immediately and covered by pressing his lips to the top of his daughter's head. Sophia looked at the ceiling and told herself it meant nothing. On the sixth Sunday, Elliot arrived 5 minutes early. Sophia opened the door with the chain still on and told him through the gap to come back at the correct time. He apologized without argument and stood in the hallway looking at his shoes until she opened the door, again exactly on schedule. Priya raised her eyebrows at Sophia afterward, and Sophia told It did not mean anything that he had accepted the correction without making it about his pride. Priya said sure and looked unconvinced. What shifted the careful architecture of Sophia's resistance was not a grand moment, but a small one. It was a Wednesday evening when she received a message from Elliot's personal number. Not his assistant, not his lawyer. Just him telling her that he had turned down a partnership deal with a group in London because the signing required him to travel the following Sunday, and he was not willing to miss his time with Rosie. He said he was not telling her this to earn credit. He said he just wanted her to know that the visit would happen as scheduled. Sophia read the message 3 times. She set the phone face down on the counter and went to check on Rosie and stood in the doorway of the small, yellow bedroom, watching her daughter sleep, and felt something inside her, chest pulled toward a direction she was not ready to name. She picked up her phone and typed back 2 words. She typed, "Thank you." She stared at what she had written for a long time, then she sent it. 3 months of Sundays had passed by the time Sophia allowed herself to admit that something was happening inside her that could not be managed. With rules and schedules and Priya sitting in the corner of the room like a beautifully loyal referee, Rosie was 6 months old and had developed opinions. She had opinions about her blanket, opinions about which songs qualified as acceptable, and a very clear and loudly expressed opinion that Sunday afternoons were her favorite part of the week. She reached for Elliot when he arrived. She made her best sounds when he held her. She fell asleep on his chest with the ease of someone who had decided entirely on her own terms that this person was trustworthy. And babies, Sophia knew, were not capable of performing trust. They either felt it or they did not. Sophia watched all of this from her carefully, maintained distance, and felt the distance shrinking in ways she could not stop by sheer force of will. It was Priya who said it, plainly because Priya had never believed in letting important things stay unspoken. She said it on a Tuesday night while they were washing dishes after dinner with Rosie, asleep down the hall. She said that Sophia was still in love with him and that this was not a weakness or a failure, but simply a fact, and that the question was not whether the feeling existed, but what Sophia intended to do with it. Sophia scrubbed the same pot for longer than it needed. Then she set it down and turned off the tap and said that loving someone and trusting them were not the same thing, and that she had learned the difference by living inside the gap between them for almost a year. Priya said she knew that. She said she was not suggesting Sophia collapse back into something that had hurt her. She said she was suggesting that Sophia stop pretending she felt nothing, because performing indifference was its own kind of damage, and Rosie deserved a mother who was not quietly breaking herself trying to maintain a wall that was already coming down. Sophia did not answer, but she did not argue either. The following Sunday, something happened that none of them had planned for. Sophia had been dealing with a situation at the restaurant all week, a supplier crisis that required her to be on calls she could not reschedule, and she had been running on short sleep and too much coffee since Thursday. When Elliot arrived, she was in the kitchen on her phone, still managing the tail end of the crisis, and Priya was at the door talking to her own mother on a video call. For approximately 20 minutes, Leah sat in the living room with Rosie without anyone actively watching them. When Sophia finally got off her call and came into the room, she stopped in the doorway. Elliot was on the floor on his back, with Rosie sitting on his stomach, both hands wrapped around his fingers, the two of them having a conversation in the particular language that exists only between parents and babies, where nothing being said is a real word, but everything is completely understood. Elliot was making a face, and Rosie was responding with a shriek of delight, and then Elliot would make a different face and Rosie would respond again, and the exchange was so natural and so genuinely joyful that Sophia stood in the doorway for a long moment, unable to move. He looked up and saw her watching. She expected him to become self-conscious. She expected him to straighten up and revert to the careful, controlled version of himself he brought to these visits. Instead, he just looked at her with an expression that was open in a way she had not seen from him in years. And he said that Rosie had just discovered that blowing raspberries was funny and had spent the last 10 Minutes being absolutely certain, he agreed. Sophia crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside them. She did not analyze the decision. She did not consult the carefully maintained list of rules she had been living by. She just sat down on the floor of her living room with her daughter between her and the man she had married and watched Rosie demonstrate the raspberry discovery with enormous pride. They sat like that for a long time without speaking. Then Elliot said her name softly and she looked at him, and he said he needed to tell her something that was not about asking for anything in return. He said he had been seeing a therapist since the week after she came to his office. He said his therapist was a quiet man named Dr. Warren, who had a tendency to ask questions that took days to answer, and that one of those questions had been about Elliot's father and what it meant to repeat a pattern you swore you would never repeat. Sophia listened without expression. He said he had spent the first 2 sessions insisting his father's abandonment had nothing to do with his behavior toward Sophia. He said he had spent the 3rd session admitting that it had everything to do with it. He said he had spent every session since then learning that a man who was never taught how to stay would find every possible reason to leave before someone could leave him first, and that the cruelty he had aimed at Sophia that night had been the cruelty of someone trying to end something before it ended him. He said none of that excused what he had done. He said he was not presenting his history as a reason Sophia should feel differently about him. He said he was telling her because she deserved to know that he understood, and what she had never deserved to receive from him. Sophia looked at Rosie sitting between them, perfectly content, chewing on a fabric ring with absolute focus. She said she knew about his father. She said she had always known, even during their marriage, that there was something in him that treated love like a threat. She said she had loved him anyway, which was either brave or foolish depending on how the story ended. She said she had spent 11 months rebuilding herself from the inside out, and that the woman who had walked into his office with those divorce papers was not the same woman who had walked out of their apartment that night. And she needed him to understand that, because if there was ever going to be any kind of future, it would not look like their past. Elliot said he understood that. He said he was not asking for their past back. He said their past had cracks all the way through it, and the only thing worth taking from it was sitting between them, chewing on a ring. Sophia looked at Rosie and felt something that had been locked for a long time move in her chest. She said she was not ready to call it anything yet. She said she was not ready to use words like trust or future or together because those words carried weight she was not prepared to lift. Without more evidence that the ground would hold, she said what she was willing to do was stop pretending she felt nothing and stop treating the distance between them like a permanent wall rather than a temporary one. Elliot looked at her with the particular expression of someone being offered something they know they do not deserve and have decided to receive anyway with complete gratitude. He said that was more than he had any right to ask. For Priya appeared in the doorway, having finished her call, and looked at the 3 of them sitting on the floor, and said absolutely nothing, which was its own kind of eloquence. The weeks that followed were not a reconciliation, and they were not a love story, at least not yet. They were something more honest than either of those things. They were 2 adults choosing to occupy the same space with intention, learning each other again from different angles, slower this time. With Rosie as both the reason and the anchor. Elliot continued his Sunday visits, but they changed texture. Priya still stayed in the apartment because Sophia was not ready to remove that layer of structure. But the atmosphere shifted from supervised exchange to something closer to ordinary. Elliot stayed for dinner once because Rosie had fallen asleep on him, and neither of them wanted to wake her, and Sophia was making food anyway. They ate at the small kitchen table and talked about things that had nothing to do with lawyers or paperwork or the past, and Sophia laughed at something he said, and then caught herself laughing, and felt the strangeness of it. How natural it felt, and how long it had been. He did not reach for her hand. He did not test any of the unspoken boundaries she was still maintaining. He simply ate his dinner and helped, cleared the table and kissed Rosie on the forehead. When she was finally moved to her crib and said goodnight to Sophia. In the quiet hallway, the same way a person says goodnight when they mean something more, but understand that more requires time to earn. After he left, Sophia stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and sent Priya a message, even though Priya was in the next room. It said she thought she might be willing to try and that she was terrified.
Priya's response came back in seconds. It said good, because terror means it matters. Sophia set the phone down and walked to Rosie's room and stood in the dim yellow light listening to her daughter breathe. She thought about the woman who had walked into that glass tower with a baby on her chest and signed her name on divorce papers with steady hands. She thought about what it had cost to become that woman. She thought about what it would cost to become the next one. She was not the same person who had loved Elliot Harmon the first time. She was someone who had survived him, survived herself, survived the particular loneliness of doing everything alone and finding out she was capable of it. That woman did not need him. She was simply choosing to see if he had finally become someone worth wanting. The difference between needing and choosing was everything. She turned off the lamp and went to her own room, and for the first time in a long time she fell asleep without the particular ache that had been living in her chest since the night she had driven herself home from a parking garage and decided to build a life from scratch. Outside the window the city kept going, indifferent and bright, full of people carrying their histories and their hopes in equal measure, trying to figure out which parts of the past were worth bringing forward and which parts were better left behind in glass offices with unsigned papers and the ghost of everything they had once believed was permanent. Sophia Reyes had learned something that most people spent their whole lives avoiding. She had learned that the strongest thing a person could do was not to hold on and not to let go, but to stand in the uncertain middle ground and choose deliberately, with clear eyes, knowing the risk and walking toward it anyway, because the alternative was a life built entirely on protection, and protection without warmth was just another name for a beautiful and very lonely cage. She was done with cages. She was just beginning to figure out what she was building instead.